Imagine stepping out of your front door tomorrow morning, right? And the fundamental architecture of your daily life has just, well, it's simply ceased to function.
Like total systemic paralysis.
Exactly. You pull out your phone to check the news, but the internet is completely blacked out. You head to the market, and the prices haven't just gone up, they've doubled since last week.
And your bank account is basically meaningless at that point.
Right. The local currency is essentially worthless overnight. And when you finally manage to tune into a state broadcast to see who's actually in charge, you find out the head of state has been assassinated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And an unelected military junta has just quietly, brutally seized total control of the country.
I mean, that is the kind of sudden state failure that leaves millions of people completely unmoored. You're just functioning in this vacuum where the old rules simply do not apply anymore.
And according to the stack of analytical sources we're looking at today, that is the exact hypothetical landscape of Iran in early 2026.
It's a really meticulously researched picture they paint.
It really is. The sources describe this massive, unprecedented military escalation in February 2026, which they term Operation Epic Fury. And in this scenario, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has been assassinated.
Right. And the economy is just an absolute freefall. I think the sources note the renminbi hitting a catastrophic 1.81 million to the US dollar.
Yeah, 1.81 million. It's unfathomable. So stepping into this immense power vacuum is a de facto military junta led by a former IRGC commander, Ahmad Vahidi.
So for you listening, your mission today, if you want to understand the mechanics of how massive historic political shifts actually happen without, getting lost in the 24-hour news noise, is to explore a highly specific theoretical phased framework.
Right. We are looking at a proposed roadmap for a democratic transition in Iran, starting from this exact hypothetical moment in 2026.
But before we really get into the weeds of this, we need to make something crystal clear. We are dealing with a variety of speculative, analytical source materials today.
Very politically charged materials.
Extremely. We're looking at blueprints from royalists, we've got critiques from federalists, and, academic procedural frameworks. We are absolutely not endorsing any of these political positions.
Definitely not. Our only goal in this deep dive is to impartially unpack these ideas exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Right. So you can understand the arguments and the actual mechanics of what these factions are proposing. We're just mapping the theoretical territory here.
Exactly. So let's start with the trigger. Because reading through these sources, the best way I could conceptualize the Iranian regime's structure leading up to this 2026 collapse was to compare it to a corporate hostile takeover.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. So imagine a ruthless group of executives takes over a massive company. But instead of trying to make the company profitable and stable for the employees, they just systematically hollow it out.
They're stripping it for parts.
Exactly. They sell off the prime assets to shell companies they secretly own. They cut employee salaries to the absolute bone to maximize short-term cash flow.
And then they use that remaining cash to fight these incredibly expensive, ruinous turf wars with rival companies in other markets.
You nail it. And that corporate raiding analogy maps perfectly onto what the sources describe as the neoliberal anti-imperialist state.
Right. And we should pause on that phrase because neoliberal anti-imperialist sounds like a total contradiction.
It really does. I mean, neoliberalism usually implies opening up to global free markets, right?
Mm.
While anti-imperialism, at least in this context, usually involves heavily sanctioned isolationism. How do those two even operate together?
Well, they operate together by basically splitting the state's personality in half. It creates this massive paradox that ultimately destroys the domestic economy.
Okay, walk me through that.
So on the international stage, the state projects this fierce, ideological, anti-imperialist resistance. It funds proxy conflicts and maintains a massive security apparatus.
Right, all of which is incredibly expensive.
Exactly. But funding that international resistance while being entirely cut off from global markets by crippling sanctions, that requires an enormous amount of domestic capital.
So where do they get the money?
They enforce brutal, predatory, capitalist austerity on their own citizens. They extract wealth from the absolute bottom to fund the military ambitions at the top.
Wow. And the sources pinpoint late 2025 as the moment this economic pressure cooker finally just explodes.
Yeah, the administration of Masoud Pezeshkian introduced an austerity budget that essentially shattered whatever fragile social contract was left.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that 2025 budget, because it's crucial to understanding the collapse. To offset the ballooning costs of these regional conflicts and plummeting oil revenues, the government decided to cap public sector wage increases at 20%.
Which, I mean, a 20% raise sounds somewhat reasonable in a stable economy.
Sure, until you look at the inflation side of the ledger.
Yeah.
The sources note that while wages were capped at 20%, food inflation alone skyrocketed past 112%.
112%. That's just unsustainable.
And it gets worse. The government compounded that misery by raising the value-added tax, which is a highly regressive policy that disproportionately drains the working class.
Right.
And then, most devastatingly, they removed the subsidized exchange rate for essential goods.
Ah, yeah, that's the linchpin right there.
Exactly. Because the subsidized exchange rate meant that importers of vital goods, like flour, cooking oil, medicine, they could buy U.S. dollars at an artificially low rate.
Which kept those basic survival items somewhat affordable for the average Iranian.
Right. But removing that subsidy meant the price of bread and medicine was suddenly pegged to the real free market value of the cereal.
Which was in free fall.
Yes. So people were earning this battered local currency, but paying global market prices for their next meal. You can see why, by late 2025, the working class, the bazaar merchants, the teachers, they were all in the streets demanding an end to the entire system.
Because the protests weren't just about political freedom anymore, they were about sheer biological survival. And this brings us back to your corporate takeover analogy and the true nature of the IRGC. Because over the last few decades, through this process of pseudo-privatization, the IRGC evolved.
They became the CEOs.
Exactly. They transitioned from being an ideological military vanguard to becoming the dominant monopolistic economic player in the country. The sources actually refer to this as the subcontractor state.
Right, because they own the telecommunications infrastructure, the massive construction contracts, the pipelines, the petrochemical plants.
Yeah.
All of it.
Yeah. And because they had amassed this unprecedented concentration of wealth and hard infrastructure, when the ultimate crisis hit in February 2026 with Khamenei's assassination, the IRGC was uniquely positioned to just bypass the constitutional process entirely.
The clerical facade was basically no longer useful to them.
Right, because by law, there was supposed to be a temporary leadership council, right?
Yeah.
Consisting of the president, the chief justice, and a senior cleric to manage the succession.
But the sources note the IRGC completely sidelined that council. They also incapacitated the designated successor, Mojtaba Khamenei, who the sources say was reportedly injured in the strikes anyway.
So men like Ahmad Vahidi, Mohammad Bagher Zulgadar, and Mohsen Reza, they just form a de facto military council and establish unconstitutional martial law.
They dropped the theological pretense because the economic and security crises were just too severe. The military explicitly took the reins to protect its own assets.
But, and this is the core argument the analysts make here, this military junta is fundamentally incapable of solving the structural collapse.
Right. I mean, you can deploy tanks to a protest, but you can't shoot hyperinflation.
Exactly. You can't arrest a broken supply chain.
So this underlying failure is what leads the sources to suggest that a transition of some kind is an absolute inevitability. The military can hold the territory, sure, but they cannot govern the economy.
Which introduces the core focus of our deep dive today, Chapter 33. It's this proposed, highly detailed academic framework designed to manage this monumental shift from a collapsed, authoritarian, subcontractor state to a functioning democracy.
Now, I have to admit, reading through Chapter 33, I found myself pushing back heavily on the premise.
Oh, really? How come?
Well, the sources lay out this incredibly rigid, decade-long phased framework. And my immediate reaction was, if the junta is failing and the regime collapses, why do we need a 10-year academic master plan?
Just rush to the finish line.
Yeah. Just set up an interim government, draft a quick constitution, hold an election, and let the new leaders figure it out. Isn't that how we typically imagine democratic revolutions working?
It is, yeah. We culturally romanticize revolutions as this single clean break. A statue falls, a vote is held, and democracy blooms overnight.
Right.
However, the framework in Chapter 33 operates on a really vital concept from comparative political science called institutional load.
Meaning the sheer amount of stress the bureaucratic system can handle at any given moment before it just buckles.
Exactly. Think of a transitioning state like a massive complex bridge that has just survived an earthquake. It's standing, but the structural integrity is severely compromised.
Okay.
If you immediately drive a convoy of massive freight trucks over it, and those trucks represent simultaneous sweeping political elections, total legal overhauls, and brutal economic shock therapy, The bridge doesn't hold.
It collapses under the institutional load.
Right, plunging the country into a failed state scenario.
So you have to sequence the traffic. You can't fix the legal code while the food supply is collapsing.
Exactly. So the framework divides this recovery into 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is the short term, designated as years 1 and 2.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that. What happens in phase 1?
The short-term phase focuses purely on regime opening and immediate stabilization. The primary objective here isn't to build a utopian democracy, it's just to prevent mass starvation and civil war. So politically, the focus is on releasing political prisoners, dismantling the secret police, guaranteeing basic civil liberties, and forming a broad, inclusive interim government.
But the economic mechanism here is what really caught my eye. The primary economic goal in phase 1 is securing the food and energy supply chains.
Yeah, absolutely critical.
Because if the bread lines are 10 blocks long and the power grid fails, the populace will turn against the democratic transition immediately. They will literally beg for a dictator to return just to make the trains run and the bakeries open.
Exactly. You have to secure biological and societal basics before you can build complex democratic machinery.
Makes total sense.
So assuming the state survives this first 2 years, you move to the medium-term phase, spanning years 3 to 5. And this is termed the institutionalization phase.
And this is where the heavy lifting happens, right? Drafting the permanent constitution, institutionalizing the rule of law, expanding actual political competition between parties.
It is. It also requires the most painful structural economic reforms. The interim government has to overhaul taxation, dismantle the IRGC's monopoly over those state-owned enterprises we talked about.
It's huge.
Massive. And they have to begin the grueling process of integrating the Iranian economy back into global financial markets.
Okay, so that's years 3 to 5. And finally, we hit the long-term phase, the 10-year horizon known as democratic consolidation.
Right. The singular goal of the 10-year mark is irreversibility. Making sure the democratic system, the checks and balances, and the civic culture are so deeply rooted that a populist or a rogue general cannot easily slide the country back into a dictatorship.
And it heavily emphasizes shifting to a knowledge-based economy, right?
Yeah.
Moving aggressively away from the historical dependence on oil exports.
Exactly.
Now, a decade-long phased framework sounds incredibly rational on paper. It's clean, it's academic. But as the sources make abundantly clear, the reality of implementing this is deeply chaotic.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because a framework only works if the architects agree on the blueprints. And it's basically like trying to build a house when the architects fundamentally disagree on whether it should be a skyscraper or a sprawling ranch. The Iranian opposition is fiercely divided on who gets to run this transition and what the final state should actually look like.
Yeah, and the source documents outline 3 primary competing models for power, and each blueprint fundamentally clashes over the distribution of sovereignty.
So let's start with the first model, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's emergency phase plan. This is a highly centralized roadmap designed specifically for the first 100 to 180 days post-collapse.
Right. Pahlavi's plan focuses heavily on continuity of state, preventing chaos, and managing the sprawling security apparatus. It basically relies on a strong central hand to guide the country through the most vulnerable window of the transition.
But the academic critiques of this plan in the sources are really severe. The main argument is that Pahlavi's model essentially reproduces the exact authoritarian logic it claims to be replacing, because it places ultimate authority across the executive, legislative, and judicial spheres in the hands of a single unelected figure designated as the leader of the national uprising.
Yeah, the critics argue that concentrating unchecked power, even temporarily under the guise of an emergency, creates this massive risk that the power will never be voluntarily relinquished.
Because history is littered with quote-unquote temporary emergency leaders who simply never leave office.
Exactly. And beyond the risk of a new dictator, there is a major structural critique regarding Iran's ethnic makeup. The centralized model tends to view Iran as a monolith.
Which it absolutely isn't.
Right. Critics argue the centralized model completely ignores the specific demands of non-Persian ethnic groups. It basically treats ethnic diversity as merely a cultural aesthetic, allowing traditional dress or local music, rather than acknowledging these groups as distinct political communities with inherent rights to self-determination.
Which naturally brings us to the second competing blueprint, national geographical federalism. This model is championed by groups representing Iran's major nations, including the Kurds, the Balak, the Arabs, the Turkmen, and the Azerbaijanis.
So if Pahlavi's plan is like an operating system with a single root administrator who holds all the passwords to stabilize the mainframe, the Federalists are arguing for a decentralized network.
Exactly. They believe having one root admin is the entire reason the system keeps getting corrupted into a dictatorship in the first place. They want local nodes holding their own keys.
So they demand a vertical distribution of sovereignty. The Federalist argument is that a highly centralized state in Iran, whether it takes the form of an absolute monarchy or a theocratic republic, inherently requires the violent repression of minority groups to maintain control.
So they argue the only way to achieve true democracy is to explicitly devolve power to regional governments.
But you can immediately see the tension there.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
The centralists look at the Federalist model and they see a recipe for the complete balkanization and violent fragmentation of Iran.
And the Federalists look at the centralized model and see a new dictator in a different suit.
They're at a complete impasse.
Which is what makes the third blueprint, the Shahnaz-Weber convergence, so compelling. It functions as this procedural middle ground.
Right. It's essentially a common minimum program. The logic here is that forcing all these fractured opposition groups to agree on a final ideological vision of the state right now is just impossible.
Yeah, if you force them to choose between centralization and federalism on day one, the transition stalls before it even begins.
So instead of focusing on the end goal, they focus purely on the process.
The Shahnaz-Weber model suggests using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, as a neutral, internationally recognized framework to guide the rebuilding of state capacity.
It separates the urgent, practical needs of transitional governance from the highly volatile, final constitutional questions.
Exactly. It is a commitment to a shared set of rules for how to rebuild the country, rather than a commitment to a specific political ideology.
Okay, but the tension between these three blueprints raises a massive, looming question about the actual viability of this phased framework.
Yeah.
You have an incredibly fractured opposition that can't agree on basic sovereignty on one side, and a deeply entrenched, heavily armed IRGC military junta on the other.
Yeah.
What are the actual odds of a successful democratic transition here? Because when I think of successful historical transitions, like the shift from military rule in parts of Latin America or the post-Franco transition in Spain, there is almost always a pacted transition.
Right, transitology.
Yeah. Moderates from the outgoing authoritarian regime shake hands with moderates in the opposition. The old regime elites agree to step down and allow elections. And in exchange, the opposition guarantees them amnesty, protection of their assets, a peaceful retirement. They make a pact.
Because mutual guarantees regarding vital interests are typically the bedrock of a bloodless democratic transition.
But looking at the IRGC structure, is a pacted transition even possible here? Are there any moderate generals left in the junta willing to negotiate their own exit?
The analytical consensus across the sources is incredibly bleak on this point. A classic pacted transition is viewed as nearly impossible.
Why? Why can't the generals just negotiate immunity and retreat to their barracks?
Because of the subcontractor state dynamic we discussed earlier, the IRGC doesn't just hold political power, they are the ultimate economic monopoly.
Oh, right.
They cannot retreat to the barracks because the barracks is the stock exchange. Introducing a transparent, competitive, free market democracy inherently destroys their wealth.
Because their entire economic survival depends on a closed, opaque, crony capitalist system.
Exactly. There is no moderate faction within the junta willing to negotiate a pact that results in their own total economic destruction.
If they give up power, they give up their bank accounts. There is no golden parachute available.
Right.
So if a peaceful pact is off the table, how does this actually play out?
The sources forecast 3 potential scenarios for 2026 and beyond. Let's go through them.
Okay, so scenario A is categorized as high probability, Praetorian consolidation.
Basically, the military digs its heels in. Yes, the IRGC junta maintains unconstitutional martial law indefinitely. They utilize extreme, overwhelming coercion to suppress the public and enforce permanent austerity.
So the state doesn't formally collapse, but it survives purely through brute force.
Exactly, with the economy remaining entirely paralyzed and isolated.
A really grim, stagnant survival. Okay, what about scenario B?
Scenario B is categorized as medium probability, fragmented rupture. And this is where the mechanisms of global impact really come into play.
Let's hear it.
In scenario B, the central authority of the military junta finally collapses under the sheer weight of economic failure and continuous public uprisings.
Okay.
However, because the opposition fails to unite around a transitional blueprint, the power vacuum isn't filled by a democratic government. Instead, a multi-sided civil conflict erupts between the various factions, the remnants of the military, and regional militias.
And the sources detail exactly how an internal rupture in Iran instantly transforms into a catastrophic global economic crisis.
Oh, it would be devastating.
Because if central authority collapses into civil war, the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the most critical global shipping choke points for oil and gas, effectively becomes an unpatrolled war zone.
And the mechanism here is tied directly to the maritime insurance markets.
Right. If the strait is contested by rival militias with anti-ship missiles, insurance premiums for oil tankers skyrocket to prohibitive levels.
Or coverage is just pulled entirely.
Exactly. Global shipping conglomerates simply halt traffic through the region.
And the economic modeling in the sources suggests this specific supply chain freeze could cause European gas prices to spike to an astonishing 60 euros per megawatt hour.
Wow. Which would trigger a wave of hyperinflation across global markets, plunging economies far beyond the Middle East into deep recessions.
It really highlights how interconnected this all is. Which brings us to scenario C, which is assigned a low to medium probability, managed democratic transition.
This is the narrow, optimistic path.
Right. In this scenario, the opposition manages to successfully adopt a federated coalition, likely leaning heavily on a procedural middle ground like the Shahnaz-Weber model.
So they integrate the political demands of the minority groups, establishing a united, legitimate front.
And because they present a unified front capable of securing the territory, they are able to open back-channel negotiations with the international community.
The naval blockades are lifted, frozen state assets are returned, and they secure the emergency economic stabilization needed to initiate that 10-year democratic consolidation phase.
But the low probability rating highlights just how extraordinarily difficult it is to align those fractured factions while actively dismantling a deeply entrenched military monopoly.
For sure. So what does all of this ultimately mean for you, the listener? Transitioning a collapsed authoritarian subcontractor state isn't a singular cinematic event.
Not at all.
It is a perilous, highly sequenced tightrope walk of emergency stabilization, complex institution building, and profound, painful social compromise.
It requires navigating a minefield where a single misstep in economic policy or ethnic representation can plunge the entire project into civil war or renewed dictatorship.
Right? And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something you can explore on your own that builds directly on that 10-year consolidation phase, but introduces a massive external variable.
Oh, the global timeline.
Exactly. The sources explicitly state that ensuring the long-term survival of a new Iranian democracy requires diversifying the economy away from its absolute dependency on oil exports.
Because they have to build a modern, knowledge-based economy to break the cycle of the state relying on oil wealth instead of broad-based citizen taxation.
But think about the broader macroeconomic reality we are living in right now. The global economy is rapidly accelerating its green energy transition. The world is actively moving away from fossil fuels.
It introduces a ticking clock that neither the junta nor the opposition can control.
Yes. If a successful democratic transition in Iran requires a full decade of painful, heavily subsidized economic restructuring, the ultimate survival of that new democracy might not just depend on defeating the IRGC or uniting the centralists and the federalists.
They are basically racing against global climate economics.
Exactly. If the world stops needing oil before Iran's new democratic government can rebuild its foundational economy, the structural collapse might be entirely unavoidable, regardless of who is sitting in the parliament or what blueprint they use to get there.
Global energy markets might secretly hold the ultimate veto power over this entire geopolitical transition.